175 years ago this month, the very first maintenance shop for the Pennsylvania Railroad's Altoona Works began its operations. The hum of the machine belts and the pounding of the hammers signified to all that America had just taken another step towards becoming the industrial nation that so many had imagined. With the shops strategically located halfway between Harrisburg and Pittsburgh, the PRR was now poised to revolutionize rail travel within the state and in turn the country. While doing so, it also led to the creation of the city and helped change the landscape of central PA. Please join us now as we hear from several area experts on the creation of the PRR Altoona Shops and what it meant for people in the area, the drama that unfolded during its lifetime, and what is being done to preserve the rich history of railroading in the area. For years, the steep slopes of the Allegheny Mountains disrupted the flow of early commerce through the region. Rugged terrain made the journey not only time-consuming, but dangerous. As a result, the Commonwealth was falling behind the efforts of neighboring states when it came to industrialized expansion. The birth of the Allegheny Portage Railroad allowed for the PA mainline canal system to finally overcome the formidable expanse of the mountain range. But with success comes ambition, and engineers for the Pennsylvania Railroad were already looking at ways to improve upon the path forward.
The Allegheny Portage Railroad was the final piece of the Pennsylvania mainline canal, and the reason that the state came up with this canal that went from Philadelphia to Pittsburgh, almost 400 miles across the state, was because of what was happening in neighboring states. In New York, you have the Erie Canal that opened in the mid-1820s. You have the C&O Canal in Maryland, and people are choosing to travel through these other states because travel is much faster. The price of goods is lower. So Pennsylvania came up with this canal system because Philadelphia as a port city was being bypassed. Travel through the state took about 3 weeks by wagon. Once the mainline canal opened, you could now get across the state on an average of 5 days. So this was the fast new way to travel. It was seen as an engineering marvel for the way that they were able to conquer this formidable mountain barrier. And the Allegheny Portage Railroad was 36 miles over the mountains and connected two canal basins, one on the eastern side of the Allegheny Mountains in Hollidaysburg and Johnstown on the western side. And they used a series of 10 incline planes with stationary engines in an engine house building at the top of each of those incline planes. And the stationary engine was the power for pulling people and goods up over the Allegheny Mountains. It took about 6 hours to go the 36 miles over the mountain. And prior to the Allegheny Portage Railroad, there were Native American paths, narrow wagon paths through the area. But the railroad was not the first idea for crossing the Allegheny Mountains. The state did consider other options because railroads were in their infancy at that time. Canals were more established in America, so one of the ideas was to build a 4-mile-long canal through the Allegheny Mountains. There were several problems with this. One was, how do you keep water in the canal? And another was how long it would take to build this. One estimate said it could take about 30 years. And there is a little bit of urgency because other parts of the mainline canal are being constructed, and we still haven't figured out how to cross the Allegheny Mountains. Without being able to cross the mountains, there's no direct route from Philadelphia to Pittsburgh. Also considered was a wagon road over the mountains. With wagons, travel's very slow. With wagons and stagecoaches, you can only take so many people. You can only make so much money because you can only fit so many people. And it was very rugged travel. It was very uncomfortable. So the state came up with the inclined plane Allegheny Portage Railroad as the best option for moving people and goods over the mountains. So once the Allegheny Portage Railroad opened, and even though the mainline canal was this fast new way to travel, we're always thinking of even faster ways to travel. And only a few years after the Allegheny Portage Railroad opened, the state was already looking at options for bypassing the incline planes of the Allegheny Portage Railroad. And with the Pennsylvania Railroad and their completion of Horseshoe Curve, they were able to find that faster mode of transportation.
And in reference to Horseshoe Curve, this isn't the first time that a railroad was considered to be brought to the Horseshoe Curve's location. It was just a decade prior that the state was looking to bring their own new railroad there to bypass the use of the incline plane system and the Portage Railroad. They wanted to bring a different idea rather than a horseshoe curve. They wanted to construct several tunnels and bridges through the mountains rather than wrap the railroad around the mountain ridges instead. That plan kept getting pushed back, and it never gained any traction, and hence the Pennsylvania Railroad jumped on the opportunity and came out with the idea of the Horseshoe Curve.
J. Edgar Thompson, who was sent out to survey for the Pennsylvania Railroad 1850-1851, he surveyed the best route possible for a railroad to go through the mountains. And he decided that the present site of the Horseshoe Curve would be the best site for the railroad to go through, which meant the track would have to go through the farmlands here at the base of the mountain, which was owned by the Robertson family. So the Pennsylvania Railroad came in, they purchased the farmland from the family, and there they started laying down the track. But they also, around that same time, 1853, 1854, they started building the original, the first shop complex, which was really a quarter roundhouse with some buildings attached to the side of it. It was nothing too grand, but it was just enough to bring in steam locomotives, a place to rest before going up the mountain, a place to rest after coming down the mountain, as well as a place to do any repair work needed for steam locomotives at that time.
They would have been belt-driven equipment. It totally would have been stationary steam engines to drive those belt-driven pieces of machinery. You would have seen a blacksmith shop, so just your basic foundry, forging those pieces of equipment, basically making repairs to existing pieces. So the likelihood of actually producing new parts for locomotives and rolling stock would have probably been unlikely. They would have sourced those from Baldwin Locomotive Works or other builders and would have brought those parts here to Altoona for assembly, and you would have seen those parts taken off of locomotives and cars and repaired here. And around that time, within the first 5 years, they would have employed about 1,000 workers. And really in the 1800s, there wasn't a lot of innovation in terms of developing new technologies. It was keeping running what they had and being able to get from point A to point B. So that was the primary focus, was the physical plant. So when you talk about innovation at that time, historically speaking, when you think of innovation, you think of motive power and equipment. But in the 1860s through the 1880s, the real primary focus was innovation through civil engineering, such as the development of the Horseshoe Curve, conquering those landmass, and being able to get a route established. And then really it wasn't until after the Civil War that the expansion really took off here in Altoona.
In the mid-1800s, the area that would eventually become the foundation for the Pennsylvania Railroad in Altoona was mostly uncharted virgin wilderness. It was there that an employee of the PRR was able to see an opportunity that would revolutionize rail transportation for over a century. Among the winding pathways that stretched over the mountains, he found the perfect place to build what would eventually become known as the world-famous Horseshoe Curve.
When J. Edgar Thompson would have surveyed, he would have came across Cantaning Run, which is the small river that went through the mountains. He determined that that would have been the best location to build what is now the Horseshoe Curve. So they would have closed off the river and then built up around it, blasted the rock, blasted the earth to form the curve. and then laid down 2 set of tracks. So the Horseshoe Curve was constructed between 1851 and 1854, of course designed by J. Edgar Thompson as well as Herman Haupt. Herman Haupt would actually become the man in charge of the railroads for the Union during the Civil War. So they designed it, and it was built primarily by Irish. About 400 or so Irishmen came over from Ireland and started work on the Horseshoe Curve. So the grade of the track, and that's going up or down, the curvature, the degree, all that was needed would have been determined by hand and by primarily using your surveying tools. Now the Irishmen, they would have been paid a few cents a day. So not a whole lot, but back then it was expected. And so they would have experienced all the hardships working up on the mountains. There would have been really no buildings. They would have constructed a shanty town to stay in. They would have experienced the harsh winter temperatures of central Pennsylvania, high up in the mountains. They would have experienced the rain. They would have experienced blistering sun. Now, I don't know how many workers passed away, if there were any that died while constructing the Horseshoe Curve, but they would have experienced extreme hardship as well as some extreme physical labor, as they would have been pickaxing away at the mountain. They would have been dynamiting it with black powder, shovels, you name it, everything would have been done. And then of course laying the rail, which would have been very heavy back then. It would have been very tiring work and difficult work, but it was done in 3 years. The fact that it was done in 3 years, I think, should go along with it being called an engineering marvel, because you would expect something as big as the Horseshoe Curve to have taken multiple, maybe decade years to build. But the fact that it was done in 3 years and it allowed travel time to be cut down from weeks to days, and now a seemingly large and passable mountain, which the country actually used at one point, was the furthest western expansion, because they didn't, it was very difficult, even by road, even by horse and carriage, to cross over the mountain. So now with the railroad coming in, they were able to conquer the Allegheny Mountains, and they were able to do it without tunneling or building a bridge. They essentially built right alongside the mountain, and now you do have the Gallitzin tunnels, you have the Allegheny tunnels, and you do have tunnels, but for the most part, it's built right alongside the mountain. You don't have big bridges spanning large waterways, and it shows that even back in the 1850s, the Pennsylvania Railroad had the conscience to know, if we're gonna conquer the mountain, we might as well do what the mountain is giving us, which is giving us ridges to be able to put track down and transport our steam locomotives carrying whatever they're carrying across the state. The engineering and the construction of the Horseshoe Curve allows exactly the right amount of grade and the right amount of curvature or degree of the angle to allow freight trains to pass each other safely.
It was a 2-rail system until the 1890s, when rail traffic really started to pick up. By 1898, a 3rd rail was put around the Horseshoe Curve, and by 1900, the 4th one was complete. So at its highest, the Horseshoe Curve had 4 rails. In the 1930s, 52 passenger trains went around the Horseshoe Curve a day.
Altoona, you could say, was at one point the gateway to the West, and that is because of the Pennsylvania Railroad going up and over the Allegheny Mountains. So now anybody that wanted to travel, any immigrant that would have came over to the United States, wanted to move west, they would have rode the Pennsylvania Railroad across the state over the Horseshoe Curve to Pittsburgh. And of course, the Pennsylvania Railroad only expanded even further. From Pittsburgh, they went north to Detroit. They went as west as Chicago and St. Louis. So you have the ports here on the East Coast that would have been receiving goods from Europe. You also have the flow of immigrants coming in through the ports of New York City, in Philadelphia, and in New Jersey. So the Pennsylvania Railroad would have picked up all of them. So not only did they transport passengers from New York City to Chicago or Washington, D.C. to New York, but they would have picked up any goods. We're talking textiles, clothing. They would have picked up these goods from the east, because northeastern United States and Pennsylvania was very industrialized. And from there, they would be put on Pennsylvania Railroad freight trains, and they would have been transported west to where they were needed. Coal was one of the larger and definitely one of the more profitable goods that would have been transported by the Pennsylvania Railroad. Coal is very abundant here in Pennsylvania, so they would have carried both anthracite and bituminous coal, and they would have taken it out west for the expansion or even just for the fuel sources, or they would have taken them east and they would have taken them to the ports in New Jersey, New York City, Philadelphia. From there, they'd be loaded on the boats and then shipped to wherever they needed to go around the world. So the Pennsylvania Railroad transported everything. And even more locally, they would have transported your mail. They would have transported shipments of milk. They transported produce. They transported everything that would have been required because you didn't have trucks back then, and wagons were starting to become obsolete. So the railroads would have transported everything that would have been required for everyday life or required to keep a country moving forward. So with the completion of the Horseshoe Curve, it allowed the Pennsylvania Railroad to not only remain in the state of Pennsylvania, but it was able to create the Pennsylvania Railroad as the largest corporation in the world at one point.
With the completion of the Horseshoe Curve, industrial development happened very quickly across the region. At the heart of the PRR's initiative was the first maintenance shops located along what is now modern-day 12th Street in Altoona. With news of the Penzies' new operation in Altoona spreading, workers came from across the state looking for opportunities to make better lives for themselves and their families. Their efforts would eventually gain the attention of the entire world.
So with the Pennsylvania Railroad setting up shop here in Altoona, you have the inflow of workers. So with them, they bring their families, and then with the expansions gradually over time, you see shop worker numbers go from 1,500 to 3,500 to 5,000. It only keeps growing, so with a growing workforce, you have a growing city. And at its height in the 1920s, you have 17,000 Pennsylvania Railroad employees alone in Altoona. And across the whole system by the 1920s, the Pennsylvania Railroad would have had about 250,000 employees, which of course would have been their height. So Altoona made up a pretty good percentage of that. So now you have the railroad industry, you have its workers here in Altoona, which allows other industries to grow and allow the city to continue growing in numbers to the point to where Altoona probably would have been considered a major city. So when you look at aerial photos or even drawings, paintings of the Pennsylvania Railroad shops in Altoona, even from its early days up to its peak, it would have spanned from Juniata to South Altoona, a span of 17 miles. You would have seen a vast shop where you have the construction of steam locomotives, you have the repair of steam locomotives, you have the construction of freight cars, you have the repair of freight cars, and you have the repair of passenger cars. But it was more than that. You had the blacksmith shops that allowed the forgery of the metals. You have the tire shops, you have the larger metal foundries. Everything that was needed to operate, to build a railroad would have been found here in Altoona. And to the point to where it was so vast that it would have became the largest railroad shop complex in the world. Mostly everything for the Pennsylvania Railroad would have been constructed here. And then you also have the scientific research that would have been done here in the field of railroading.
So initially in the early days of testing, they would have just simply brought in the existing motive power that they had. So the smaller engines would have been on a static treadmill, where they would have just tested from an analysis perspective, not an innovation perspective. And what they did by doing so was establish baseline. So, of course, there were many different types of steam locomotives designed for passenger use or freight use, designed for long haul or regional short hauls. So they would have said, okay, we're going to test this one particular type, get the analytics from it, and then start seeing where, where are the efficiencies, where are the inefficiencies, and take it apart component by component and say if we, look at making an improvement to one aspect and then seeing the ripple effect in terms of overall performance.
And Altoona at one point had 3 roundhouses, 2 in Juniata alone. So that alone shows the sheer size of the operation of railroading here in Altoona, to the point to where people over in Europe would have come over and went through the shops and seen these shops firsthand. So Altoona really became a railroad city with the largest railroad shops and would have been known worldwide.
As the story of what was happening in Altoona continued to spread, more and more workers came from around the globe. Many at the time had never before seen a land of such opportunity or a chance to make a difference in the world around them. Their legacies endure to this day, with places like the Allegheny Portage Railroad and the Railroaders Memorial Museum paying tribute to the hands that performed hard labors and helped build a nation.
A lot of early railroaders that came to Altoona actually had apprenticeships or experience at Pennsylvania Railroad Harrisburg shop buildings. So they didn't just come to Altoona and learn right away on the job. They came experienced, just like the Irish that built the Horseshoe Curve. They would have had the experience of their being hard workers and being relied on doing the work that was needed. Same thing with building the shops. You had experienced builders from Philadelphia, Harrisburg, come to Altoona and construct the shops, and then you brought the shop workers themselves from the Harrisburg shops to Altoona, because Altoona would outperform the Harrisburg shops. So you already had a workforce that had knowledge and or experience in this field. So the Pennsylvania Railroad in Altoona was able to kick off at a very high note. Mid to late 1800s, you have Manifest Destiny, the Western expansion, and our country is really starting to form the identity of being an American. So these railroad workers that were constructing the steam locomotives, laying down the track, building the shop buildings, I believe they would have all realized that I am playing a role in the continuing growing of the country. I'm going to be very proud of the work that I do to keep expanding and moving our country forward.
So you would have had very primitive shops with wooden floors, the belt-driven equipment. There would have been hazards in every turn and corner at that time, and there was a lot of fatalities, a lot of injuries. It was hard physical work with technologies that weren't really refined from a safety perspective. They were just results driven.
I often think about the people living in this area at the time and how fast technology changed, how fast transportation evolved with the Industrial Revolution. You go from 3 weeks to 1 day in such a short period of time. I often also think about, for engineers and state officials to come up with the idea is one thing, but to actually build this system and make it work is entirely different. And it's really amazing how they did this with a lot of muscle power. A lot of the folks that worked on the railroad were Irish immigrants in a strange land, away from their families, doing this hard work with hand tools. So how they made this work is absolutely incredible and is a testament to their work ethic.
As the reputation of the Pennsylvania Railroad's Altoona shops grew, so did its fortunes. The PRR eventually began to build a thriving city around the operation and made sure that it reflected the success that the railroad was able to build in the area. One of the most prominent facets of the flourishing city was the Logan House. The hotel was the epitome of opulence at the time, and within its walls, one of the most important events in American history took place.
The Logan House Hotel, it was built in the early 1850s, and it was actually funded by the PRR here in the area. And as many residents know from here in Blair County, it was one of the most opulent hotels in this area. Altoona being the middle point between Philadelphia and Pittsburgh, it saw a lot of traffic coming off of the trains in the area with passengers who were stopping here as that midpoint on their journey from one side of Pennsylvania to the other. And as such, the hotel saw a lot of distinguished guests arrive to it, celebrities, foreign dignitaries, politicians. It was a very well-respected and well-dressed hotel that really was at the top of its class here in the area for quite a while. Over time, though, as with many things here in the area, its popularity and really its effectiveness as like a midpoint stop on the railroad kind of diminished. And of course, that was due to the rise of automobiles for one, and kind of the diminishing presence of the railroad as the big passenger transportation industry here in the United States, not only just in Pennsylvania. And as such, the late 1920s, it closed in operation. And in the early 1930s, the United States government actually purchased the property that the Logan House stood on, demolished it, and built the post office, which stands there on 11th Avenue to this day. One of the most important events of the Civil War, and indeed probably the most important event that has ever occurred here in Blair County, was the Loyal War Governors Conference that occurred here in September of 1862. In essence, what this was it was a meeting organized by Pennsylvania's wartime governor during the Civil War, Andrew Curtin, and he gathered 12 other governors from across the North, and they decided to meet here in Altoona. We're not only the central point of the state, but at that time, Pennsylvania was kind of the keystone of the Union. We were like right in the middle almost of the northern states that comprised the Union during the Civil War. And as such, it was seen as a good meeting point for everyone to meet here. And Altoona in the Logan House was selected for this meeting. And Andrew Curtin really sought out to assemble these governors and meet up and to discuss wartime policies and even review early drafts of the Emancipation Proclamation. Of course, the Emancipation Proclamation was issued by President Lincoln, and in effect, it freed all enslaved peoples held throughout the Confederacy at that point during the war. In September of 1862, the war really was not going the North's way in a lot of ways. Battle after battle was being lost. There were some successes being gained out west, of course, but especially on the eastern theater of the war, it was a pretty bleak situation at that time. And as such, Governor Curtin and many northern authorities during the war really saw this meeting that would occur at the Logan House as crucial to boosting morale and really unifying the North, unifying the Union behind this message of victory. The meeting did achieve all of its goals. Those goals being, one, the commitment to supporting Lincoln. Two was the promise of boosting support for the war throughout the Union, and of course that meant supplying more men and material to the Union war effort. And then three was approving some of the wartime policies. One of those being, of course, the Emancipation Proclamation, which was implemented during the Civil War. So overall, it succeeded in its goal of really rallying the North and just really putting the message through that we can win this war and we can reunify the United States.
At several points throughout wartime history, the PRR Altoona Shops and Horseshoe Curve's reputation was so prominent that they actually became targeted for destruction. At this point, not only was the Pennsy shipping coal, iron, and steel for continued industrial expansion across the country, it was also shipping soldiers, supplies, and armaments to support the wars that occurred. The goal of the enemy combatant was always the same: destroy the railroad, destroy the war effort.
One of the things that surprises a lot of people is that the PRR shops here in Altoona were actually under threat by the Confederacy during the Civil War. You think about 1863, specifically the summer of 1863, the Confederate Army under Robert E. Lee was slowly making its way up north, and there were real fears in southern and central Pennsylvania that should the Confederacy be victorious in any battle that may occur around that region, they could come up here to Altoona and take control of the PRR shops, which, throughout their prime were kind of one of the industrial hubs of the United States. So there were fears that if the Confederacy got a hold of these PRR shops and either used them for their own means or destroyed them, that was going to be a significant domino that would fall against the North and their operations during the Civil War. And as a result of this, precautions were taken to prepare Altoona, Blair County, southern Pennsylvania for a Confederate invasion. And indeed, the PRR shops were prepared for that as well. Drills were held for evacuation measures during this time. And right around the Battle of Gettysburg, I believe just a week or so beforehand, there were such fears that the Confederates would come into our area here that supplies were actually evacuated out of the PRR shops here in Altoona. So in a lot of ways, much like later conflicts, the PRR served as one of the industrial tools that would really serve the Union well during the war. And if we lost that, if the North lost those industrial tools, there were real concerns over whether the war could be continued or not. Had the Confederacy actually been able to come up here and either A, capture Altoona, or B, at the very least, disrupt the operations of the Pennsylvania Railroad in this area, up to and including the destruction of the shops and the facilities, there is that question of whether Altoona could have continued as a town. That's one of the interesting what-ifs that we like to discuss here.
Horseshoe Curve, being an engineering marvel, was known throughout the world, and the German Abwehr, which is their version of the CIA during World War II, developed a plan to send saboteurs to the United States to destroy military targets and some civilian targets that would be detrimental to the war effort. Aluminum factories were on the list, hydroelectric plants, and the Altoona works of the Pennsylvania Railroad, because of their ability to repair and build freight cars, and the Horseshoe Curve was a primary target for them. The Germans were certainly aware of the Horseshoe Curve for two reasons. One, it had become a worldwide known engineering marvel for the ability to get trains over the mountain. And it should be noted the Germans had spies here in the United States who were well aware of what facilities were being used to produce materials for the war and what facilities were being used to transport them to the front lines. And speaking specifically for the Pennsylvania Railroad, 90% of the freight produced in the United States for the European war effort came through the Pennsylvania main line. It stretched as far as St. Louis and Chicago. So all these war materials coming through Horseshoe Curve, if they could blow that up, it was really a convenient spot to create a logjam of supplies. The Germans invested a great deal of money and resources in a submarine operation along the eastern seaboard to sink ships. But there would be no ships if you could shut down the supplies of material getting to the eastern seaboard. This Operation Pastorius, they called it, for the first German immigrant to the United States, sent two four-man teams. One four-man team landed on Long Island in New York. The other four-man team landed in Florida. They had explosives, including explosives made to look like pieces of coal so they could plant them along the rail line. And they also had $80,000, which is the beginning of their problem, because about 6 of the 8 were not really faithful Nazis. There were 2 that were faithful Nazis. The other 6 were really looking for a way to get out. They had all lived in the United States, so when they got here with $80,000, going to restaurants and entertainment was a lot more appealing than blowing things up and risking their lives. So 2 of the men, George Dash and Ernst Berger, met in a hotel room. And Dash said to Berger, if we don't agree on this, only one of us is going to walk out of this room. and Dash revealed to him that he wanted to turn the plot into the FBI and thought it would make him a hero. So he went to a telephone and called the FBI. They thought it was a prank call. And he had actually traveled to Washington to the FBI building there, where he turned the whole plot in. And they were arrested and put on trial. The 6 that did not turn themselves in were eventually executed as saboteurs. The other 2, Berger and Dash, they were sentenced to life in prison, but after the war they were sent back to Germany, but they weren't really welcome in Germany because they viewed them as traitors, and they weren't welcome here because we saw them as spies and saboteurs. So they didn't end up the heroes they thought they would be. The entire situation during the war, even when the war broke out, the federal government required alien German and Italians to register with the federal government. Here in the city of Altoona, the Altoona Police Department collected guns, binoculars, radios, and things from them. Even with that, there was still spying and going on. There was a pilot from Blair County that was shot down. And when he was interrogated by the Germans, they had information on his school record that had appeared in the Altoona Mirror. So somehow they were getting these stories that were local news stories back in Germany during the war. And after Operation Pastorius had been stopped and the men were arrested, the FBI came and did a series of raids on 175 homes in Altoona, searching those homes for various contraband. If there were radios, they smashed the insides of the radios because it didn't take much technological know-how to convert the radio to a two-way radio. So there was a great deal of concern for safety and security during the war. Even the federal government prohibited the taking of photographs of trains because they were carrying war materials on them. And if you look at photographs from the war, you see lots of passenger cars, you see lots of box cars, but you don't see many of the flat cars that were hauling tanks and half-tracks and trucks and things like that, just for the security of the war effort.
During World War II, the PRR saw a resurgence from the slow decline that it was suffering from. Suddenly, millions of military personnel were riding the railroad to and from the ports that carried them off to or home from the war. In an era where ordinary people went off to do extraordinary things, the PRR Altoona Shops continued moving its freight forward. Only this time, it did it with determined women performing the hard labor. In doing so, the ladies showed the world they were capable of maintaining the operations of the railroad and forged their own undeniable legacy.
In the 1920s and 30s, the railroad was actually in a mode of decline, primarily because of the invention of the automobile and its popularity during the 20s, and then the 1930s for the Great Depression. So when the war hits, it's really a boom for the railroads to see their traffic increase. For the Pennsylvania Railroad, their passenger traffic increased by 400%, and the freight traffic increased by 200%. So that was a huge boom for the railroad. For example, the Pennsylvania Railroad moved 1.4 billion tons of freight, and a great deal of that came through Altoona on the Pennsylvania main line and headed to the eastern seaboard for transportation to Europe. In fact, so much traffic is being carried, the Pennsylvania Railroad moves 17 million soldiers, Marines, sailors, and airmen during the war. 17 million, that's a remarkable number considering we had 16 million in uniform. So obviously they're counting trips to the seaboard and then trips when they come back home. And that really helps, at least for a while, put off the fate that's coming for the Pennsylvania Railroad in the 50s and 60s when they eventually have to combine with the New York Central Railroad. But at the time, it's a great deal of success for them to have all this passenger traffic. Even in the city of Altoona, they don't have enough passenger cars. So in our car shops here, they start taking old 50-foot box cars, cutting portholes in the side of them and putting benches in them to serve as troop carriers. The Pennsylvania Railroad is so popular with their design, the federal government asked them to give it to the Pullman Company to start building more of these cars for other railroads to use as troop carriers during the war. To move an entire division of soldiers during the war, it took 65 entire trains. So that's a massive amount of railroad manpower and supplies to do that. And moving all those passenger trains were the 450 K4s of the Pennsylvania Railroad, which is a well-known engine here in Altoona. It's the state locomotive, and we have one here in the possession of the Altoona Railroaders Memorial Museum, and they're currently working on restoring that. But it's certainly a local icon, the K4 that we have here, number 1361. And the K4s played a major role in the war effort, moving those troop trains. For the Pennsylvania Railroad, 44,000 of their workers ended up serving in the military during the war. And that's a huge void to fill. And some of those are filled by older employees, former employees, but half of them, 22,000 of those jobs, were filled by women who served a number of jobs, including brakemen. They also served jobs as ticket takers, crane operators, office workers, yard workers. The women workers are symbolized by Rosie the Riveter, who really emerged from a song that was popular in 1942 called Rosie the Riveter. And then it was made into an image by the Westinghouse Company for a poster that everybody knows today has become iconic, with the woman wearing the red polka dot bandana and flexing her bicep.
And then you also have Casey Jones, who was actually a railroad employee here in Altoona. And they proved that women can indeed do a man's job, which would have been working in the soot, the dirt, the noise of a industrial workplace.
They really filled in a large number of roles during the war, but sadly at the end of the war, the Pennsylvania Railroad issued a memo that said basically, get rid of the women. Once the men are coming home, the women are no longer needed, let them go back to their duties that they were performing before the war. We had thousands in uniform. Over 10,000 from the county served in uniform. We had over 400 men and one woman make the ultimate sacrifice for the war.
During the height of construction for the PRR operations in Altoona, a town was constructed on the mountain above the Horseshoe Curve to house workers of a recently discovered coal mine in the area. In its early days, the town was an invaluable resource to the steel industry that was growing in Johnstown and Pittsburgh. Sadly, though, the town of Glen White only exists in the old black and white photographs and history books of today, as it fell victim to the railroad's continuing decline.
Glen White's kind of unique because it was a town situated in the middle of the Allegheny Mountains that basically showed up because of the Pennsylvania Railroad's construction of the Horseshoe Curve. In Glen White's early days, there was a man named Brian Kelly. He was one of the first landowners at what was Glen White. He was a laborer for constructing the Horseshoe Curve and even the rail line back to where Glen White would be. The people who built the Horseshoe Curve lived in shacks, so then when the Horseshoe Curve was completed, they found that there was these plentiful coal mines there, so people stuck around. People who worked at Glen White and people surrounding the Horseshoe Curve, there was plenty of laborers around keeping an eye on things and make sure all the operations were going on schedule and swiftly. There was plenty of interactions to make sure that when trains were coming down from Glen White to Horseshoe Curve for exporting coal, that there was an available track and there was steam engines there ready to receive the product. It was a little community of its own. They had a school, a church, a company boarding house, a store, and about 25 company homes that families shared once at a time. So it was about a population of 250 at its highest. And so many people were coming and going that the population changed all the time. So it was a little community of its own that had all the necessities of a typical town today. There were several towns like Glen White across Pennsylvania, and even the United States. But for the Pennsylvania Railroad to construct the new Horseshoe Curve in the 1850s, that brought an industrial town of Glen White, Pennsylvania to life. And it was a coal mining and coke oven town. Towns like that all across the state were set up shop where product was found. So coal, iron ore, and lumber. They had those products, but having the Pennsylvania Railroad accessible to these points made their success much better. So Glen White got its start as a lumber business and coal mining business. Their product was used everywhere, from the steel mills to even in people's homes. The coal was used to heat their furnaces. And then when the lumber started to fade back in the 1870s. That's when the coke ovens came in. It became a coke oven town in the 1880s when the steel industries in Pittsburgh and Johnstown began to rise up. The coke from the coke ovens was used in those steel mills, and what coke was, it was a product of coal being burned to a certain degree and then cooled. It was a product that would burn thousands of degrees hotter than coal ever would, so it was a necessity for the steelmaking process. Glen White disappeared off the map in the early 1940s, largely because of economic struggles all around for the company, and even the Pennsylvania Railroad was beginning to have some struggles of its own as it was trying to develop more steam engines when other railroads surrounding were focusing on diesel. So as we see this shift in the revolution of railroads, work wasn't as easy as it once was when Glen White was a booming town. You didn't have much coal to be sold, and the number of customers was slowly shrinking. Glen White disappeared in approximately 1941, 1942, when the company went into a voluntary receivership. It tried to get started back up again, but ultimately it was sold at sheriff's sale to M. Glosser Brothers for scrap, and then eventually sold to the city water department. The reason it amazed me so much is that there were families living in an industrial town like Glen White that had all the memories that we have with our families. They had those for themselves, and to think that just a day in the neighborhood at home now, that neighborhood atmosphere was available at Glen White, and now you look at it, and being gone for 85 years, you wouldn't even know that today. So reviving that history was really important because there are several people around the city of Altoona and Glitzen and such that have connections to this town, and reviving this history is important because these are how our ancestors made their living, and it all wouldn't have been possible without the Pennsylvania Railroad. So this little tidbit of history is really important because the labor that took place at Glen White helped build the United States, essentially.
The Pennsylvania Railroad in Altoona wasn't immune to the effects of mechanical failure or human error, and that led to many tragedies occurring around the area. Many lives were lost as a result of the train wrecks, but many more stories about selfless acts of bravery, kindness, and sacrifice are still told to this day.
With the introduction of the steam locomotive, the steam transportation, there also becomes risks. Not only are you able to move people faster, but there also becomes the unfortunate side of accidents. And Altoona has seen its fair share. Accidents that happen nearby and accidents that happen right at the heart of the city. And most of the time, it involves a steam engine that was built here in Altoona, or it involves the shops repairing and rebuilding the damaged cars. So Memorial Day weekend, 1893, there was a circus in the area, and that circus was the Walter L. Main Circus. And Walter L. Main was a rather large circus for its time. It had exotic animals that you would normally never see here in Pennsylvania. And it was leaving Tyrone, and it was descending the mountain. And the engineer in charge of the locomotive only had enough braking power to 3 or 4 of the 17 cars. So those 3 or 4 cars were the passenger coaches where Walter L. Main himself would stay, as well as other circus performers. The remaining cars behind were the larger animal cars that carried your elephants, your lions, your tigers. The train was going down the mountain. It made it around several turns, but it unfortunately did not make it around a last bend. And the locomotive itself, as well as the passenger coaches, made it around the curve, but that first animal car was carrying the elephants. And it is believed that the elephants were rocking because being scared back and forth, which would have ultimately caused their car to derail at that bend, and therefore all the other cars behind derailed as well. As a result of the wreck, Hundreds of horses were killed. There was 5 individuals killed as well, including one of them being a young boy who ran away from home. He wanted an adventure. He wanted to go out to the big world. He snuck onto the Walter L. Main circus train that night of the wreck, and unfortunately he was killed in the wreck, and the rescuers didn't even know they were looking for a child because they didn't know he was missing. The family of the child came forward and said, "My child is missing," and it was only then that they had to search for a boy because he was a stowaway on the circus. The big cats had to be caught and tied with a rope to a tree. The birds and the snakes escaped. They were never caught, and a tiger did kill a local farmer's cow nearby. The tiger had to be hunted down and was ultimately shot by the locals. After the wreck, the town of Tyrone and the city of Altoona opened their arms. The wounded were cared for in Tyrone and in Altoona, and the Altoona Shops here actually rebuilt the Walter L. Main circus train for him to continue on with his circus free of charge. And as a result of that, Walter L. Main was very grateful to the city of Altoona. And the years after that, he came to Altoona and put on his circus for free for everybody in the city, in the area to attend. On November 29th, 2025 will be the 100th anniversary of the 17th Street wreck here in Altoona. A 58-car freight train was traveling down Horseshoe Curve eastbound, bound for Altoona. The train, while descending, lost its brakes and came down the mountain too fast. With the engineer blowing the whistle and the fireman ringing the bell, they were warning the city of Altoona that their freight train was coming in fast and out of control. It jumped the tracks right at 17th Street and caused a massive pileup on the 4-track main line. Unfortunately, the engineer and the fireman were both killed in the wreck, and the wreck caused significant damage to the area and also hit very close to home because it happened right in the heart of Altoona. So you had thousands of people flock to the streets. They were looking at this wreck. There was debris everywhere. So it's a wreck that is more likely forgotten about, but it is a significant one because it was a major one that happened here in the heart of Altoona. On the morning hours of February 18th, 1947, a Pennsylvania Railroad passenger train between Detroit, Michigan and New York City called the Red Arrow was traveling through the Gallitzin tunnels. Unfortunately, as it was making its way out of the Gallitzin tunnels, it would derail at Bennington Curve in between Gallitzin tunnels and Horseshoe Curve, and it was heading eastbound towards Altoona. The Pennsylvania Railroad and the ICC did a report. They did their accident report on it, and it was determined that it was excessive speed coming out of the Gallitzin tunnel which caused the derailment. The recommended speed going around Bennington Curve is 30 to 35 miles an hour. It was believed, according to the ICC and the Pennsylvania Railroad reports, that engineer Michael Billig, who was in the lead engine, K4S number 3771, had the train going anywhere between 65 to 70 miles per hour. So he was going double what the recommended speed was, and they think that is what caused the steam engine to flip or roll over 2 other tracks before going over the far embankment down the mountain. As a result, 24 individuals lost their lives, 4 of them being locally, with hundreds more injured. So a total of 4 wrecked derricks came up to Bennington Curve to help with the cleanup. Hundreds of individuals flocked from the nearby small towns to help the injured get out. Hundreds more people came up via passenger trains from Altoona, nurses, doctors, other railroad workers, welders, torchers, anybody to come up and try to cut the cars apart to help the wounded out. All wounded would have been brought back to Altoona and they would have been cared for at the hospitals, and cleanup would continue for a couple months afterwards, and it would become the site of another unfortunate derailment with the loss of life. So 10 days after the Red Arrow wreck on February 28, 1947, a Pennsylvania Railroad passenger train called the Sunshine Special was heading westbound from Altoona, heading towards the Gallitzin tunnels. And the Sunshine Special was running 50 minutes late out of Altoona. The last car on the Sunshine Special was a Pullman car called the Cascade Mirage. And the Cascade Mirage was where several passengers, including a Pullman porter by the name of Lee Keyes from Houston, Texas, were, as well as a flagman with the last name of Mulvihill. In the late hours of February 28th, the train was approaching the Gallitzin tunnels when the Cascade Mirage became uncoupled from the rest of the train. It then sped going eastbound, heading towards Bennington Curve and the Horseshoe Curve, traveling at tremendous speeds. According to the Altoona Mirror, February 28, 1947, Mulvihill, the flagman, woke up all the passengers and told them to get down on the floor because they were essentially a runaway train. The porter, Lee Keyes, he went and jumped on the emergency brake to turn to try to get the train to stop. The Cascade Mirage would actually go right past the Red Arrow site where there were still people working on cleaning up the wreck. They saw the Cascade Mirage go by at about 50 miles per hour, where about 3 miles from the Gallitzin tunnels near the curve, it jumped the tracks and slammed into the rock face. Unfortunately, the porter, Lee Keyes, he lost his life. All the other passengers, some were able to escape uninjured, some were injured, but Lee Keyes is known as a hero to those passengers because he was the one on the emergency brake that was unfortunately suffered the impact when it slammed into the rock, as well as flagman Mulvihill is seen as a hero for waking the passengers up and getting them down on the ground, the lowest point, to protect themselves.
Known as the largest railroading operation in the world at one point, the Pennsylvania Railroad Altoona Shops created many state-of-the-art components to help revolutionize the rail transportation industry. Now, one of those components was the world-renowned test lab, where engineers designed the iconic K4 steam locomotive, a machine that is near and dear to the hearts of many rail fans and historians around the world.
So by the 1880s, when the routes were established and expanded, the existing motive power fleet was really underperforming. It wasn't large enough to meet the demands of the expanding railroad. They were short on motive power in terms of the actual size of the equipment. They didn't have the horsepower to meet the demands of the ever-growing length of trains or the tonnage of freight trains. And in Europe, they had refined steam locomotive technology in advance of the United States. So a lot of the leaders at that time of the PRR looked to their counterparts in Europe and what they were doing to innovate and develop better steam locomotives. So through that study and traveling to Europe, they were able to implement what essentially the Pennsylvania Railroad established as a test department. And what better place to establish that test department than right here in Altoona because of the pre-existing vast shop complex that was here. They got into the locomotive testing, where in 1904, through a display at the St. Louis Exposition, in the traditional sense you would think of the World's Fairs. It was fairs around the United States where industries such as the railroad would go and demonstrate to the public new technologies and innovations. All kinds of different technologies would be on display, but in particular the railroads established a trade mill spearheaded by the Pennsylvania Railroad, where they would bring in all different types of locomotives from across the country, from different railroads even, and put them on display on a static treadmill where visitors could go in and see them actually testing the performance of operating steam engines within a room. When the exposition closed in 1904, between 1904 and 1906, They transported it to Altoona to the test department, where they expanded the test department to include the static treadmill, as well as a very big expansion to the motive power development department, where engineering and scientists worked together to develop steam locomotives, which gave way to the development of the K4 class and the L1 class steam locomotives. And so they developed the K4 to be really the first mainline passenger steam locomotive, with the L1 being its freight counterpart. And in 1914, when both of those locomotives were developed, both prototypes were built, with priority given to the L1 class to be built first during World War I. And you wouldn't see the second K4 out of 425 locomotives be built until 1918 and later into the 1920s. There were aspects of the K4 that were very desirable by these other railroads and other engineers. Almost every large steam locomotive and passenger service used or designed by other railroads emulated some aspect of the K4, even in Europe. The K4's tractive effort made it very versatile. So its design gave it the speed, but also the versatility to haul longer trains than its predecessor classes. And that meant more money for the railroad. That meant more revenue. If it was able to haul longer trains at a lower cost, at a faster rate, and more reliably, that meant a very positive impact to the bottom line. And that's really why the locomotive class lasted for 40 years in service until the 1950s. And also coincided with why it was never really successfully replaced. The railroad had developed larger locomotives to replace K4s, because as trains became longer, even in the 1930s and 1940s, they would add 2 K4s to a train. The railroad wanted to design a new locomotive called the T1 class to replace the K4s, but it was a little bit too late in the game for a number of outside factors, such as the development of diesel-electric locomotives that replaced steam engines. The T1 was the apex of steam innovation and design for the Altoona works. The T1 just did not have the advantages of time on its side. It came too late in the game. It was really an old technology that was being brought into existence when a new technology, such as the diesel-electric locomotives, which would be replacing it. They were cost-effective, required less maintenance, and had more tractive effort. Here at the museum, when we talk about restoring K4 1361, we want to bring back that nostalgia. Hear the whistle blow, hear the steam, the smell, the coal burning, soot, and just see the drama of steam railroading and its glory, and show society what it was like to live back in those days, but also to highlight the accomplishments that our ancestors were able to do with the employment through the Pennsylvania Railroad.
The Railroaders Memorial Museum is in possession of the only remaining rail-worthy K4 steam locomotive in the world. They're currently in a fundraising phase for the restoration effort. If you'd like to make a contribution to bring this rare piece of railroad history back to life, please visit railroadcity.org for more information. For decades after the first foundation was laid, thousands of people continued to come to Altoona seeking a new life. Many immigrated from across Europe, and with that, they brought their cultures and traditions with them. They integrated with the others who came with the same dreams and ideas, and they gave life to the vibrant city that was once a farming pasture.
Well, the Pennsylvania Railroad has founded Altoona, and when they founded it in 1849, they obviously were going to build their repair shops here at the time, and were looking for employees, and so they physically recruited 3 groups of immigrants to come and be their employees. They recruited the Germans, who were well known for their precision and adeptness at making machinery and utilizing it in the shops. They recruited Italians who were very well known for their work with cement and mortar and building, so they could build the stone arch bridges that the railroad needed to cross the rivers and streams. And they brought the Irish because they were hard workers and muscular, and they could use the pick and the axe and maybe a little dynamite and blast through the mountains to build places like the Horseshoe Curve. So that was the initial group that came. And then in the late 19th century, in the 1800s, 1880s, groups of East Europeans came seeking employment. And these groups came from Eastern Europe and from Russia. And they settled here. And many of them went to work in the railroad shops. And that was a second influx of Jewish immigrants, these from Eastern Europe, and they joined the German immigrants that were already here, and they also opened up businesses. And then we had another influx of immigrants in the 1900s, early 1900s. These were the Italians, late 1800s, early 1900s, and they came and they both opened up businesses, little restaurants and so forth, and also worked in the railroad shops. So they came for employment and to also have and be employers. And then in 1920 was the large immigration, because immigration was being restricted by the government. So the last big year for immigrants to come in was 1920, 21. And large groups of Italians again, and this time Greeks and people from the Middle East. Syria and Lebanon came. And they essentially did not work in the railroad shops. They opened up their own private businesses, usually restaurants. Many of the Greeks went into the theater business and opened up movie theaters, as did some of the early Jewish families. And most of those from the Middle East opened restaurants. So these groups all helped make Altoona a big melting pot. They depended on the railroad for their businesses, and the railroad depended on them for their employees. So it was a nice symbiosis. So there was a lot going on with the immigrants when they came here. They really built a lot of this town. This was later reflected in the fact that Altoona was known as the city of churches. It had a church virtually on every corner. But the church architecture was absolutely beautiful because there were so many denominations, large and small, and the buildings were just wonderful pieces of architecture. The churches started building as early as 1853, and that was like three years after the city really got settled. And 5 of them in the first decade or so were built on Gospel Hill. Now, many people don't realize Gospel Hill is a very large hill in downtown Altoona, and it stretches from the top of the hill, where today there's a very large flagpole, but it goes down to the virtually to the railroad tracks. And the railroad was instrumental tangentially for that. The engineer, Mr. Wright, who was hired by the railroad to lay out this area, purchased plots of land in West Altoona. That's the part of Altoona on the present-day downtown side of the tracks. And in order to get people to move there, 5 churches were built. And that's how it gets its name, Gospel Hill.
As more and more train whistles echoed off the buildings in downtown Altoona, the desire to set up shop in the middle of all the action grew among the merchants in the area. This gave rise to avenues lined with many unique shops and to the prototypical mall, Gable's department store. Altoona's downtown retail era was so vibrant, folks from neighboring towns and cities came to shop, drawn in by the allure of a big city.
Altoona's retail was thriving It actually started on 9th Avenue where the first railroad station was, and then quickly within about 5-6 years it moved to 10th Avenue. That's the street along the railroad on the other side of town, and that was lined with the Logan House Hotel. And once they built that hotel, the businesses switched sides of town and opened up on 10th Avenue, and that quickly became filled. And so they moved up to 11th Avenue and then ultimately 12th Avenue. There were all sorts of huge, beautiful stores. And then by the 1950s, they had all remodeled them into the 1950 commercial Art Deco period. And the biggest store, of course, was Gable's, which was a big department store. Mr. Gable had 44 departments in his store. And it wasn't that he controlled them all, but he was smart enough from the very beginning to get individuals to come in, and so-and-so would run the shoe department, or this company would run the candy department. Everything a big modern department store would have, he had. He kept on adding to his store. The store started in the middle of the block, and he kept on buying the properties next to it clear to the corner. And when he occupied all of that, he still needed more space. So he went behind the alley, behind 11th Avenue, the alley that separates 11th and 12th Avenues, and he started buying up the properties on 12th Avenue, ultimately until he had purchased the whole block. So that was a major store, the demise of which were, of course, the malls that came in the late 60s and 70s, actually in the 50s, some of them. People would get dressed up to go downtown in those days. I mean, high heels, a hat, white gloves. You see the old photographs. The gentlemen wore suits even if it's 90 degrees out. And it was the day out. People from all the surrounding communities would come in. And it was a big thing in the 50s when they started having evening hours, because this was really helpful for people who worked till 5 o'clock. You have to remember, stores were closed on Sundays. So the only day you could shop if you worked till 5 o'clock was Saturday. So when they would have Thursday evening open to 8 or something, that was a big deal. So Altoona was a drawing card, not only for Blair County, but a lot of the surrounding counties with towns that bordered Blair, like Ebensburg or Birmingham, and even State College would drive here and make it a day.
Each evening, the lights adorning the many theaters and performance venues in Altoona would flicker to life, signifying that the show would begin soon. Early theater owners knew that the performing arts were a vital part of a cultured community and that there was no shortage of them to provide an evening's entertainment. At any given time during its heyday, dozens of theaters were in operation at once, all vying for the patrons' money and attention. Altoona's performing arts scene became so widely respected that it once served as a testing ground for popular variety entertainers, associated with an era that is widely known as the heart of American show business.
Altoona, from its inception, had 100 theaters. But early on, theaters were never really financially successful. So people who built them would tend to put them on the top floor of a building, and therefore they could rent the first floor and the second and third floor to commercial establishments. And the theater would be on the top floor and would be opened maybe on the weekend or a couple times a week or something like that. And you could tell those buildings today that are still standing, because if you look up, the top floor, the windows are taller than the rest of the floors. That's a giveaway that there's a big room up there that was used for meetings or theaters. The Jaffa Shrine brought in very famous German opera singers singing German opera, and they would give recitals at the old Jaffa Mosque. And then later on, around the turn of the century, by 1905, they started opening up silent film theaters. These are usually one-story buildings. One of the oldest was the Palace theater in Altoona, opened up by two German immigrant gentlemen. And when these two brothers, toward the end of their career, built the Strand movie theater in 1916, which was probably the most magnificent theater in Altoona. The building was all steel, it was fireproof. To get up to the balcony was a huge sweeping ramp, all marble. The lobby was immense. It stretched, I would say, a good 100 feet inside. Its backstage was not deep for live performances. So in 1961, it was demolished for urban renewal. But the theater that did survive was the Mishler Theater. So out of 100 theaters, the big movie theaters and so forth, the Mishler survived. It was not built as a movie theater. It was built as a stage in 1905. Mr. Isaac Mishler built it. He spared no expense. It was, he claimed, fireproof. It was built in an ornate style with carved cherubs on the walls and ceilings and angels here and carved plaster. It was all gold leafed. It was really beautiful with a massive chandelier in the center. But that theater burnt down in the first year. It was built, opened in February, in October it burnt. Why did it burn? The building next door was also brand new. It was a 5-story furniture store. So it was stuffed full of 5 floors of stuffed upholstery, which was shipped in those days in big crates with sawdust type material to pack them in. So this was all in that store, and one morning at 4 in the morning, the custodian was cleaning and he smelled something burning, and he went downstairs to find out what was going on, and there was a fire, and probably internal combustion started in the sawdust and the packing materials. The fire was so intense, it went out the back of the furniture store, and the window to the backstage at the 2nd floor height, the window was broken with the heat. The fire went into the back of the theater behind the curtain. Mr. Mishler had put an asbestos curtain in, because in those days fires usually started in theaters on the stage where they stored the scenery. Scenery was very flammable. So the scenery caught fire, but instead of the asbestos curtain preventing the fire from going into the auditorium of the theater, the asbestos curtain was hung on a wooden rod. So the wooden rod burnt. The asbestos curtain fell, and the fire spread to the entire theater. Mr. Mishler rebuilt that theater starting in October, and he opened it up, I think it was the 1st of February the following year. So he rebuilt it very quickly. The walls stood, the brick walls. That theater became a movie theater in the 1920s, and then by the 1930s, it had been reduced to a second-rate theater showing old cowboy films, because the other theaters in town had come along, movie theaters that were built and were much bigger and fancier and ultimately air-conditioned and what have you. So with Altoona's redevelopment in the 60s and 70s, they literally tore down all the theaters downtown. The Mishler escaped that fate by a movement of people within the town to save it, and ultimately it was restored to its original magnificence and still stands to this day. Vaudeville shows were usually performed in towns outside of New York first to test them out, to see if they could withstand Broadway. So they would go to towns like Philadelphia or some other large town. But in 1914, they picked Altoona as the test town. So Altoona was the off-Broadway show place for shows going to Broadway. And that was because the vaudeville stars were performing in New York, and then the next stop would be ultimately Chicago. So they would ride the train, have to pass through Altoona, maybe midweek on the train, and they would get off the train for an overnight stay at a hotel that was close to the Mishler Theater, and the Orpheum Theater was another theater a block away. The Orpheum was on the Keith Vaudeville circuit, so it routinely got Broadway shows. Mr. Mishler booked them individually, so they weren't routinely getting all the Broadway shows, but they got a lot. So the Ethel Barrymores and the Lillian Russells and the George Burns of their day, the big stars, all played in Altoona because they were stopping on the train overnight or for some other reason, came to Altoona and performed. So Altoona was well known as a theater town.
As with all dynasties, the PRR eventually fell. It became another victim to advancements in travel technology. While it was the solution to old methods in the early 1850s, it became what it replaced just over 100 years later. More and more started to turn towards the efficiency of automobile and plane travel, leaving the once bustling ticket windows and area train stations to eventually fall silent. While train travel certainly hasn't faded completely, one can only wonder what it would have been like to stand among the hustle and bustle of people waiting to board the train to take them to the next destination in their busy lives.
The irony is that the war effort helped save the railroads and prolonged what was going to happen. And it really was two things that caused that. First, the federal government, when the war started, they really controlled everything. They started gas rationing, which helped increase the passenger traffic. But at the same time, they told the railroads you can't build any diesel engines. So those materials were needed for the war effort. So the railroads relied entirely on their steam operations. So for the Pennsylvania Railroad, when the war was over, instead of converting to diesel, they said, look, this worked during World War II. We'll just keep doing what we're doing. We have the largest facilities to build locomotives and railroad cars in Altoona. We'll just keep that operating the way it is.
So diesel motive power was coming about in the 1930s at a very primitive stance. It was being developed more or less to replace steam locomotives in urban areas to cut down on the soot and smoke. And through that innovation, they discovered, well, it required less maintenance. It was less, manpower to operate, and the parts were relatively inexpensive to replace as components would wear out. So as the technology improved, other locomotive builders adapted. Those shops changed and evolved with the technologies, and the railroad determined it was cheaper for them to purchase from outside builders than to change the tooling in the shops here in Altoona. However, it was determined that the shops here in Altoona could be adapted into being maintenance and overhaul facilities.
You see the airline industry taking off. You have the interstates being constructed.
General Eisenhower, when he's in Germany, is really envious of their Autobahn system, their massive highway system that allows them to move goods and supplies and men very quickly. When he's president, he decides the United States needs that. So in the 1950s, he authorizes the interstate highway system, and that leads to a further demise of the railroads.
So now people are starting to step away from riding trains to purchasing and driving a vehicle, to flying an airplane from, let's say, New York City to Chicago, which is much faster than taking the train. And then freight, while freight would have still been its biggest source of money making for the railroad, you see the trucking industry start slowly taking over. So now goods being transported, let's say from Harrisburg to Pittsburgh, don't really need to go by rail anymore. They can go by truck. And then with that, you start seeing the decline in railroads. You start seeing bankruptcies, railroads start going under. That's what would happen with Penn Central. They declared bankruptcy. When out of that became Amtrak, the primary passenger mover for the United States. And of course you have Conrail in 1976 taking over the freight. And now with the Horseshoe Curve, you see a massive decrease in rail traffic that went from seeing hundreds of trains a day, both freight and passenger, or a combination of both. You see maybe a dozen or so trains go around on a good day. So the Horseshoe Curve, and here in Altoona, is still vital to the railroad industry. It's still a good place to catch a train, bring your kids to hear a train horn, but it's definitely seen a decrease in rail traffic and its rail supremacy, as you can say. So as a non-native to Altoona, when I came here, I realized the importance that the railroad industry played in making Altoona what it is as a railroad city. You have the creation of the Railroaders Memorial Museum. We preserve and keep the story of the railroaders who would have built and worked for the railroad industry here in central Pennsylvania. And then you still see the hustle and bustle of the Norfolk Southern shops. While yes, it's not as grand as it was 100 years ago, the fact that Norfolk Southern still uses it as a repair facility, as a paint shop, that would have been done here by the Pennsylvania Railroad as well. And they're still using Pennsylvania Railroad tracks that would have been laid down. And while we don't hear the steam whistles anymore, what you hear are the diesel horns of a more modern railroad. So the Pennsylvania Railroad is still very much here in Altoona, and hopefully we can preserve that. We can keep the storytelling of our ancestors, of our railroaders who came here before us to construct the shops that are still here. During our height of our tourist season during the summer, we see thousands of visitors here to the Railroaders Memorial Museum, but we see tens of thousands visiting the Horseshoe Curve. And I think you can contribute most of that to the large workforce of the Pennsylvania Railroad. The Pennsylvania Railroad expanded all the way out to Missouri. So now you have Pennsylvania Railroad fans out there in Missouri, and they would have known about the Horseshoe Curve. Maybe their great-grandfather or their grandfather rode around the Horseshoe Curve. And so we get people all across the United States, and as well as some international travelers, mostly from Europe, that either hear about the Horseshoe Curve or, again, they know it from their own family history. And so now you have an international base of visitations coming to the Horseshoe Curve.
To echo what the curator of the Railroaders Memorial Museum just mentioned, in addition to the visitors at the Curve and Museum, many rail fans and historians congregate daily on the walkways and bridges that cross over the mainline tracks in downtown Altoona. Many of them come armed with their trusty camera, hoping to snap the perfect shot of history in motion. Thank you, and we hope that you enjoyed your time with us on this journey through local history. We hope that you've been able to gain an appreciation for the hard work, ingenuity, and sacrifices of the railroad workers who came before us and built what would become the largest railroad operation in the world. And we hope that you appreciate the railroad employees who are still working today, ensuring that trains are still traveling the country to deliver the goods that we need to make the world go around. After all, those workers of yesterday and today are undoubtedly the most important part of the entire story.